Hello. Now we're going to look at reviewing the literature. As you do your work, as you study, you have to read the literature in order to understand the problems, the issues, and the phenomena you're dealing with. You have therefore to absorb the research, and very often you'll have to write that up in the form of essays, papers, proposals for projects, or possibly in the end even papers for publication. Most papers for publication do refer to the literature. They have at the end of them a citation list, and in the text they will consider what has already been written about the problem. So when you write, for example, a research proposal, you will need to look at the literature to know where your starting point. But let's get something quite clear here. The objective of the literature review is to establish what we know about the problem to be studied. What you should not be doing in the literature review is producing a general survey of the literature, which simply shows that you have read a lot and you know a lot about what has been published and written on the subject. Instead, we have a specific reason for reviewing the literature. There is now so much literature that it is an absolute obligation to be selective when using the sources that you will use, and also to be focused so that you use them in such a way that you are telling the right story. So, when we review the literature for a proposal or a paper, we're using the literature as a starting point for the investigation. You're answering the question, what do we already know about my problem, so that I don't need to repeat the existing knowledge? Where is my starting point in order to say something new? So as you review the literature, it enables you to compare studies with each other and to compare your study as you start to do it with the results of other studies. So when you finish your work, you'll still be reviewing the literature, hopefully, by comparing what you've done with what other people have done, which will also help to define how you have pushed forward the frontiers of knowledge in your research project. So the review of the literature will sum up existing experience with a problem, or perhaps with a methodology. We need to review the literature on the problem in an early stage of a proposal or a dissertation or something, or a paper. And then as we define our own methodology for analysing our own data, we may need to refer back to the literature on methodology in order to justify the methods that we have used or compare them with other studies and the methods they've used. So a competent investigator will have a thorough knowledge of the literature. Perhaps that doesn't mean writing about everything one has read, but it certainly means that the investigator will know what literature to cite and discuss in the literature review, such that he or she does not miss fundamental work on the topic in question and is able to discuss it with some confidence. But once again, let's remember that the point of the literature review is not to demonstrate that you are clever and know lots of things and have read a great deal and can produce a broad brush picture of the whole of whatever, disaster risk reduction. Instead, the literature review should be focused and comprehensive. So, there is also a question about what length a literature review should be. Now, if you are writing a paper which is a survey or a synthesis of the literature, perhaps the whole paper would need to be about the literature review, and the length of that would depend on how much literature you have to review and how you wish to couch your review, what you have to say about the literature. But you have to be careful not to go off the beam and start discussing things that are irrelevant or semi-relevant, and also to be selective in what you discuss in your review, to generate and develop insight into the literature, and to be well organised in the literature review so that you have a clear and solid, robust narrative in your review. So there is an art to doing a literature review. You should ascertain before you start how much space you can afford to devote to the literature review, and use self-discipline in your writing, or actually you can write in an undisciplined way, providing then you go back and revise in a disciplined way your own work. And that might mean cutting out a fair amount of words, a fair number of words that are perhaps not so useful, in order to bring the review down to the appropriate size. But it is a good principle not to ramble when you do a literature review. So, supposing we have to start with definitions. Now, we often, in the field of disaster risk reduction, have problems with definitions. I once met someone who must have been into stamp collecting or something, who claimed to have found 220 definitions of the term resilience. Is this helpful? Well, no, it isn't. Certainly there are books and papers out there where you will find lists of definitions of terms like resilience or vulnerability or hazard and exposure, and often you'll find that there are 2 or 3 dozen definitions in the table that the authors provide. Well, we could easily get bogged down in the definitional debate. Unless you are writing explicitly about definitions and therefore contributing to that debate, what you may find is that you want to limit your discussion of definitions, or indeed avoid the whole problem altogether. So with very common terms, then you could assume that the reader is well enough versed that you don't need to define them. But perhaps, above all, where there are terms like vulnerability and hazard and so on, resilience in particular, where there are multiple definitions, you might like to briefly, and by briefly I mean in 1 or 2 lines, supply a working definition where you're telling the reader, well, look, I know there are multiple definitions, but for the sake of getting this work done, I'm using the following definition as my working definitions. You can believe other definitions, you can prefer other definitions, but we have to have a working definition here. And I'm telling you this just so you know how I am defining the term for the purposes of the research that follows, and perhaps also for the purposes of doing a critique of the literature. So a working definition is not needed where terms are common and we have a reasonable consensus on their general meaning. But where there might be uncertainty, for example, resilience is a term that has proved particularly difficult in this respect, then it is a good idea to define it. You can use, for example, UNISDR's 2009 glossary, where there are some very well-agreed definitions derived from pretty good consensuses, and they are often the source of a good working definition. So you make your working definition in order to be able to use the term in practice, as it says here, for the sake of argument, where you need to be clear about when you use the term resilience, what exactly do you mean, or any other term that is in this position. So you would choose your working definition on the basis of the one that is best adapted to the study that you are doing. Now, when you review the literature, there's often a tendency, there might even be pressure to concentrate on the latest literature. One always needs to be up to date, or so the theory goes. You don't want to feel that in reviewing the literature you've missed something that's fairly recent because you haven't been looking at the latest literature, and you want to be there at the cutting edge of science, and therefore perhaps you'd be most interested in literature published in the last 2 or 3 years. Well, that's all very well, and in certain fields at certain times, the biggest advances are the most recent, but that certainly isn't true universally. And there is an unfortunate result from concentrating too much on the latest literature, that very often we end up redoing things unaware that things were done a long time ago. For example, perception studies and studies of drought. Well, there were some very good ones in the 1960s and early 1970s. And what we often find now is that new studies come out where the authors unwittingly repeat the methods and the conclusions of the 1960 studies because they haven't read them and they're not aware of them, because they think all they need to do is to read the latest literature. Well, that begs the question of to what extent is recent literature cumulative? To what extent does it build upon previous literature? And what I'm telling you here is that where the authors are unaware of landmark early developments, they have a tendency to repeat them, very often not as well in modern terms, but unfortunately with little to add to the originals. So in this respect, it is important to go back in time and see whether there aren't these landmark studies and whether one can't benefit from reading them and citing them. It gives you a deeper and better perspective on the literature. And we have 100 years of academic studies of disaster. So if you don't go back to earlier developments, you might miss something quite vital. And it's possible that if your work is reviewed by someone more expert than yourself, they will immediately see that you're unaware of some of the principal developments in the field. So we need to bear in mind that although some of the older literature is now well and truly surpassed by modern developments, there are still plenty of early works that are equally valid today as they were at the time they were written. So, from the period about 1965 to present, there is a great deal of research which has simply not become redundant and outdated, and that is worth bearing in mind when you do a survey of pertinent literature. So, you want to try and be sure that you don't miss something vital when you look into the literature. You've got to be selective, and you've got to concentrate on those works in the literature which are most useful to your case, but you want to ensure that you collect and that you look at as much of the relevant literature as possible to ensure that you get the right sources. And you can start with the mainstream academic literature in journals and published books. Now, we have a series of leading publishers here which are listed. Oxford and Cambridge University Press have been around for 500 years. Most of the others, well, there are university presses for example, Harvard or Johns Hopkins or other universities, even UCL has one. However, the major publishers are often the commercial ones, Elsevier, which was founded in 1420, Springer, which was founded in 1840, Wiley-Blackwell, which was founded by John Wiley in 1806 in New York, Taylor and Francis, which has absorbed a number of other publications, Macmillan, Emerald, MCB, and so on. And you can look in Google Scholar or Scopus or PubMed or other major search engines, and they should direct you towards the principal academic literature. If you cannot get hold of a book in the library or by getting it through the publishers in PDF form, then perhaps you can find it on Google Books, or at least parts of it where you can perhaps read bits of it online. It seems, though, that with a good university library, much of what you need you would be able to download in PDF form. So a great deal is available, providing your university can get past the paywalls that protect journals and books from being downloaded by anyone. And that is often the case with mainstream literature. But there are other categories of literature. They might be useful, and in some instances they might be absolutely fundamental. We'll call them the grey literature. These are things that are published not in the sense of the mainstream literature, where something will go into a journal. Originally, of course, journals were all simply printed and put on shelves and distributed and so on. Nowadays, even the back numbers have been digitized, and the whole run of the journal will be online at the publishers and downloadable. The grey literature may be available for a certain period of time and then it may disappear. It may be available with certain difficulties. It may be available on websites that eventually are taken down. So we need to search for the grey literature, and perhaps one of the best places is to look on Prevention Web, which is a service run by the United Nations, and it will enable access to literature of all kinds that is relevant to disasters, crises and emergencies, and is freely downloadable. Prevention Web does not list anything that is behind a paywall. However, it is very good for reports, working papers, surveys and yearbooks, which are freely downloadable. And you can sign up to it as well and receive notifications. I receive them quite literally on a daily basis from Prevention Web, and then I look through the items on offer and I download anything that I think will be useful in the future. Now, you can also use news articles, and in this context it is better to use the more reputable news sources, such as the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Guardian, and so on. However, you do have to be careful with news sources to evaluate how objective a news article is. It may be written from a particular perspective, there may be few controls upon its accuracy, and it doesn't go through the peer review that academic articles go through. Now, to get the literature of all kinds, but principally the academic literature, it's a good idea to use search engines. My preferred one is Google Scholar. I sometimes use Scopus through Elsevier, although Scopus is somewhat restricted to articles of a certain scientific nature. If I were looking for medical literature, I would use PubMed, which is the primary source for health-related literature. And there are other search engines, even regular search engines can be useful, especially for certain grey literature and for news items. Of course, there are sites that will have search engines on them where perhaps you might look at an online library and search through it with the site's own search engine. But the success, the art of searching for literature, of winkling out the important things, is very much a matter of judgment, and the art of having and applying judgment begins with the words that you put into the search engine. So you can use words like and, particularly and, but you can also use or else, the Boolean operators, to separate key terms, and you can use combinations of key terms. For example, drought and Botswana. And that should get you articles from the mainstream literature on drought in Botswana. So you can use various combinations of words, and it is a good idea to do several passes through your search engine and see what it comes up with. You can also narrow searches to certain periods of time if you have any particular reason for supposing that you want literature from a particular epoch. So then you can start to follow up leads. You get a particular citation, you read it or download it, and perhaps you can look at the literature in it, in the citation list, and see whether there's anything there that needs following up. So you can end up with chains of searches. You can search for particular items where you put the title of the article into Google Scholar or something, and then are able to access the article itself. Or you can simply search with search words and keywords, and they perhaps will get you to the right literature. But you've got to be careful to use your combinations of keywords in ways that assure you in the end that you've done enough to get to the essential literature and not missed something vital. And of course you have to use judgment about what is useful to you and what isn't. You may find in a longish scientific article of perhaps 6,000 or 7,000 words that only a sentence or two or half a table or a figure is any use to you. So in fact, speed reading or selective reading is very useful in this, and you can get through more literature without having to plough through a whole book full or something that simply, for the most part, isn't useful and contains one or two gems that tell you what you really need to know. So to be successful in reviewing the literature is very much a matter of thoroughness and judgment. You have to decide what is useful. That means being discerning and being selective. Now, to review the literature properly, you don't need to cite everything. In fact, selectivity is the mark of a good literature review, not putting everything into it. Nowadays, so much is being written and so much is being written that a comprehensive survey of everything is out of the question. Therefore, selectivity becomes more important with every day that passes. Literature surveys and proposals need to be even more selective because you have little space in which to do the literature survey. In a paper, they need to be comprehensive, competent, and selective, and perhaps you have more space in a paper or in a thesis even, to review the literature. But in a proposal, you might have to be highly selective and restrict your comments to those sources in the literature that are the most useful, and perhaps only a handful of them, 5 or 6 maybe, sometimes even 2 or 3, that are of direct relevance to your study. So, how to capture the essence? It really isn't necessary to read things from cover to cover. You need to learn the art of being discerning as you read. In other words, don't waste time on reading things, often preparatory things or conclusions that are not directly relevant to your study and things like this, or how they did the analysis when what you're really interested in is what they found out in the paper. And therefore, you need to be able to learn the art of getting quickly to the heart of the matter, finding what you need, the one quotation that summarizes what you can get from a particular item of literature. So, where are the helpful parts, the particular paragraphs, even sentences or tables or figures that tell you what you need to know? And as you go to the end of the article and look at the citation list, is there something in there, the title of which suggests that it is definitely promising for further investigation? So, you are building up a picture of a problem, and you're building up a picture of developments in science on that problem, on studying it, on finding out about it, on pushing forward the limits and so on. But are there gaps in that? Are there fruitful, promising areas where it hasn't been studied enough, where not all of the answers are known? And this will help you to define what you need to do in your own study by suggesting avenues where there is scope for doing something that will contribute to this body of literature, but hasn't been done before. Now, it's often quite a difficult thing to find gaps in the literature, and there's always that nagging sensation. It's particularly bad for PhD students in their final year, that perhaps they're unaware that somebody has done it all before. In fact, I recall in my final year as a PhD student, I found a study that had just been published that very month that was uncomfortably close to what I was doing. But as I read it, I soon found that there were enough detailed differences that it really didn't harm my own thesis. And that is often the case. But nevertheless, if you are thorough enough in your literature review, you will probably discover properly where the gaps actually are. So you can make notes on the literature and then organize them into a coherent narrative. When you review the literature, your account needs to be a coherent narrative. So make a structure for your review. Do things in order. Make sure that you're building up your argument in a coherent way. So you need to have there a mixture of factual statements, including things like quotations from the literature. And by the way, you should only quote to render eloquence. If something is not eloquent, there is no point in quoting it. You can use your own words and, of course, make the citation to the originator of the idea, the concept. Your task is to generate insight through reviewing the literature, insight into a particular problem. That requires then the combination of bringing up the literature descriptively, so-and-so said this, so-and-so wrote that, and then providing a critical insight on that basis. However, we do not know much about this following problem. whatever the statement you need to make in order to add that critical layer. But it is absolutely important to stick to your research topic and not review literature that really is inessential to the answer to your problem. So I often find that in papers about specific aspects of disasters, they start by saying disasters are a big world problem and we have lots of disasters, maybe 600 a year, and Asia has more disasters than the Americas do. And it goes on in this very general vein, and all of that really must be left out. It is not necessary or relevant. A little bit of setting the scene, perhaps, but not to the extent where we need to regurgitate the basics. Instead, go straight to the heart of the matter. Now, you can look at your literature review once you've written it and ask a series of questions of it. Firstly, is it the right length? You don't need to or want to go on too much, and therefore brevity is a virtue. On the other hand, you don't want to be so brief that your review is superficial if you have the opportunity to write enough. Perhaps if you are constrained by stipulated word lengths, then you simply have to honour those. In that case, you would need to be selective to a maximum degree in how you review the literature. However, literature of the right length, pertinent, focused, well-structured, clear and logical, and written in good English. So, and also, when you do that, make sure that you are citing things properly, that you have a standard system of citation, Smith, 2015 in brackets, and that sort of thing. Now, a good literature review then is well-organised, well-structured, and it is a mark of professionalism. It is a reassuring sign to anyone who evaluates the work. In other words, you are at an early stage of your proposal or your project or your paper saying, well, look, I know enough about what has already been done in this field, and I can put it over to you so that you start to read my work with confidence that it is established on a firm basis of preceding science. And in fact, all science builds upon what came before. Virtually nothing nowadays is done, as it were, in a vacuum by starting from a completely fresh viewpoint. And we might as well accept that and build upon other people's previous work. Thank you.